Hello, I'm Janice Karen, Director of Policy, Technology, and Innovation at the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium, or MHDC. I run our Data Governance Collaborative, also known as the DGC. We start each of our weekly meetings with a series of industry quick updates to learn about new and proposed regulations, laws, standards, industry initiatives, and other activity. Join us for this week's updates. And if you'll go ahead and go to the first update. So ONC, this actually was put out a little while ago, has put out a data brief on API access to EHRs. And this is interesting because there's two separate distinct pots of data that they used, and one of them was from 2020 and the other was from 2022. Some of the things that were interesting is that they found that 9 out of 10 hospitals do have some type of patient access API, and 60% of them allow some form of patient rights. And more than 2/3 of the hospitals do that via FHIR. The rest of them are some other type of API, whether that's proprietary or a different standard. They also noted that between the 2 years, the growth of patient access via FHIR is happening a little bit faster in smaller hospitals. It's not clear if that's because the larger hospitals were already ahead and therefore had less of them needed to catch up. But in any case, I thought that was interesting because we often spend a bunch of time talking about the fact that this process is typically easier for larger hospitals and larger hospital systems. Another thing that was really interesting out of this data set was that 50% of the hospitals supported some type of API access to data from outside of their EHR. They didn't specify. I'm not sure exactly what form that is. I don't know how much of that is. For instance, it might be imaging systems. I know we've talked in the past about some limited forms of access to imaging. So it's not clear to me entirely what that span of data is, but I thought that was a pretty high number and very encouraging. Now, note that there was a pretty significant disparity among EHR vendors, hospital size, and hospital system affiliations. And also, even if they use some form of standards-based APIs, whether that's FHIR or some other, most hospitals have some form of proprietary API access in addition or instead. And they also pointed out one thing that was interesting is this is solely access. So there was no indication, again, of how much or what type of data was being shared. So if there was any API access at all, then they got the yes. And again, some of the questions, some of the data distinguishes between FHIR-based APIs and other APIs, and some of it doesn't. You can find out more information in the full breadth of data they share with all of their spiffy graphics and stuff at the link that's on the slide. Any comments or questions from folks? All right, then let's go on to the somewhat similar data brief that was released yesterday. So this is similar but slightly different. So this data brief is looking specifically at patient access via both portal and smartphone apps. This is solely 2022 data. Those of you who've been with us for a while may remember that we've actually reviewed previous data briefs that covered this topic, and this is just more recent data. So some of the key takeaways here is that about 75% of patients were offered some form of access to their online medical records. And again, that encompasses any form. And about 60% of patients in total were both offered and used their online medical records. And sometimes they distinguish between, say, online medical records or portals. Sometimes they just say online medical records. Sometimes they say apps. So there are a few places where it's not entirely clear if the online medical records encompass everything or not. So that's one thing. Like here, it's like that would imply that doesn't include portals because they call that out separately. So just be aware as we go through this that there may be a little bit of ambiguity around that in places. But what was interesting was another thing they pointed out is that the frequency with which patients access data seems to be increasing. So about 50% of the patients that were offered access, so not that had that accepted and used them, but 50% of those offered access them. Oops, that should be accessed at least 3 times, and nearly a third of them at least 6 times over the course of the year. And so I think that's also interesting and encouraging, because a lot of the data, it's also interesting that they're looking at higher numbers, because in past reports it was access once versus more than once, and now they're getting enough access that they're making, you know, more defined categories of more than once. So I think that's a good sign. Also, not surprisingly, app use increased and web-only portal use decreased, but they were still at almost 50% of users, and these numbers are of the people who accessed one or the other or both, not of the total offered. 48% were still web only, and about 20% used only the app, and then about a third of the group used both. People who use the apps access their data more frequently, not surprising there. And now this one also, I'm not entirely sure what this means in the context of apps, but they indicated that a third of the patients who accessed their records downloaded them. Obviously, when you're using a portal, you can make that distinction really easily. And I don't know if, I'm not entirely sure whether there's a really good way of making that distinction for someone who's using an app. And then the other thing that they pointed out that was somewhat interesting but not surprising was that the access was pretty common across all provider types, but definitely significantly higher for primary care than other things. So you can find the full report again with spiffy graphics at that link. And anyone have any comments or questions? All right, then let's move on. Excuse me. So just so folks know, DaVinci has released a new version of their DEQM implementation guide. That's data exchange for quality measures. And it came out like a week and a half ago or something like that. And so this IG, for those of you who need a refresher, there's 2 implementation guides that are related to quality measures. There's the quality measures implementation guide, or QM, and that's where you actually digitally define measures. This guide is actually controlling the data that gets collected and returned in response to the specific quality measures related data. It also has some gaps in care functionality. So what changed? There were a lot of smaller changes, and unfortunately it's not a backwards compatible update. For instance, some of the resources that were around in the past that were IG specific have been removed in favor of more general versions of the resources. That's one thing that isn't backwards compatible. There seemed to be something of a focus on making care gap improvements, and also adding more documentation and examples. So you can find a full list of what changed in this version at the link that's there. And any questions or comments?
How quickly does one have to move to this new version?
That's really up to, so that's an interesting thing, because that's really up to the exchange partners, right? There's no like mandated use of any of for other than in the future, presumably EPA and a few of the even there, they don't mandate using these specific implementation guides. Some of the CMS rules, you know, heavily rely on and are in line with the various DaVinci implementation guides and other implementation guides, but there's no specific mandate that this is the way that you do quality measures. So it's really left up to each individual set of partners as to when they're ready to move forward. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
It still seems a little free-for-all-ish.
It's still the entire ecosystem really is a little bit free for all-ish, until we get to a point where there's industry-wide agreement that this is the mechanism, or that's the way we're doing X, Y, or Z. And to some extent, some of that gets put into laws and regulations. There's always going to be some people that won't act unless there's a regulation around it, and other people who are going to jump early. And there's other mechanisms for doing a lot of these things. So the fact that you can people will coalesce around industry standards and standard ways of doing things, but that doesn't mean that everyone's going to use that unless or until it becomes some type of requirement to do so. So unfortunately, that's kind of the world we're living in right now. Anyone else want to comment on any of that? All right, then let's move on to the next update. So those of you, we covered in August that there were some issues around the No Surprises IDR. That's the independent dispute resolution process, where payers and providers go if they can't agree on what the payment should be for services. And there had been some changes made at that time based on some court activities in August. And they made some further changes and ended up closing the portal entirely to new disputes on September 21st. They've reopened that only for individual disputes and not including air ambulance coverage on October 6th. So batch disputes are still can't be opened. You have to hold on to those if you have them. And the processing of the continued processing of batch disputes that were already started at the point when things closed down are still suspended. So now, so what does this mean if you're engaging in this process? If you had an official dispute deadline according to the rules that fell between August 3rd and November 3rd, you will have until November 3rd to initiate a dispute. And that's a set date. If you have new disputes that where the dates fall between October 6th and November 3rd, you'll have 10 days to do the things like select an entity to be your mediator, pay the related fees, submit the offers, and start the process off. And if you had anything that was in process had to be completed 10 days after October 6th, which has already passed. So you can find a little bit more information. This is the main IDR page, and the CMS has taken to putting updates about what's going on with this at the top of the page. And then if you keep scrolling down, you can get to their standard steady state content around this. So any questions here? All right, let's move on. The Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, has put out a report on CMMI. That's the group in CMS that does the experimental alternate payment plans and tries to determine how well they perform and whether they should be adopted more widely. And it was created as part of the Obamacare law and has been in effect since 2011. And the expectation was that CMMI would save Medicare money. And what this report found is that it very slightly increased federal spending. You'll note it's 0.1% of the spending across 10 years. And the report talked quite a bit about where uncertainty was introduced in their numbers. And some of the factors might lead to overestimations and other to underestimations, and some they weren't sure about. And there were a sufficient number of uncertainties, and it's a sufficiently small 0.1% number, even though 5.4 billion sounds like a ton of money. In this context, it's not huge. That it's not clear how much you can bank on it really being an increase in federal spending, but certainly close to even in one direction or another is probably certain. And they are anticipating that this trend will continue in the next 10-year period, including the little bit of time that's already gone by in that period. And part of what they pointed to was that CMMI tests a lot of stuff, and the vast majority of them don't get promoted or show to be successful strictly from a financial perspective. I will say, as some of you know, we've talked about it this call, CMMI is actually they've been focused primarily on financial savings in the past, but they're looking to balance their mandate is value savings, and that includes both financial savings and better outcomes. And they are looking a bit more on quality measures and trying to show that they're improving outcomes. So the financial aspect of this is not the only component of these CMMI models, but strictly from a financial standpoint, only 6 of them have shown statistically significant savings, and only 4 of the 49 models that were explored in that time period were certified for expanded use outside of the CMMI programs. So from the standpoint of strictly the financial perspective, it's a lot of experimentation, and they didn't necessarily have a ton of models that met the financial barriers for being promoted or being recommended for wider use. So you can find the full report here. Again, take it with a grain of salt because there's a lot of uncertainty in it. And also note that CMS and CMMI are looking to spend more time focusing on the other half of the value component moving forward. But it's still interesting that this has been kind of the result so far. Any questions or comments? All right, moving on.
Actually, can I ask a quick question?
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Do you know what the 4 models were that generated significant savings?
I do, but I'm not sure. I don't remember off the top of my head. They actually call them out in this report if you want to take a quick look. And after we go through these other
Yeah, if I can find it in the report, no problem. Thanks.
Yeah. So let's move on for now, though. All right, so the FDA has put out their technology strategy for 2024 through 2027. It's basically kind of like, this is what our mission is. This is, again, it's a strategy document, so it's not going into excruciating amounts of detail. They are focusing on sort of 6 areas. One of them is having a shared IT system and a shared approach. Improving their infrastructure, modernization. None of these should be terribly shocking. They're explicitly calling out sharing data and also adopting more AI. So it will be interesting to see what they start doing in those 2 areas that particularly impact us. And they put out a specific IT mission statement, which, as you can see on the screen, fits right in with the type of stuff that we do. So it will be interesting to see how this develops and where this goes, and if this has any impact, particularly on the medical device side, just in general on interoperability and also what they do with AI. Any comments or thoughts there? All right, let's move on then. AHRQ has put out a report about hospital readmission data. It was really interesting. It covers 2016 to 2020, so it includes the initial phases of the pandemic. And they do make some comparisons between the pandemic portions and the pre-pandemic phases of this time frame. But what was particularly interesting was that most of the metrics were mostly unchanged between those 2 time periods. The readmission rate was pretty much constant throughout the entire period at 13.9%, which sounds high to me, but Medicare has the highest rates and private insurance the lowest. Probably not shocking to anyone. Also probably not shocking to anyone, Medicare patients under 65 have a much higher readmission rate than those over 65. given that those patients, people who qualify for Medicare under 65 typically have a little bit more going on medically, that's not entirely shocking. What I did find interesting was that the overall average rate across all of the different types of insurance tracked pretty closely with Medicaid. So Medicaid was sitting right at the average. And self-pay and was a little bit below it, and insured patients were at the lowest rate, and the other public plans were higher. There was a disparity in between urban and rural areas, where rural areas tended to do better and urban areas worse. There also was some racial disparities, with non-Hispanic Black patients having the worst readmission rates, and non-Hispanic, Asian, and Pacific Islander patients did the best. They also took a look at different conditions, and this is mostly in order. So blood diseases had by far the highest readmission rates, and then after that, endocrine metabolic, genitourinary, and respiratory diseases followed on. Those last three were pretty similar, and then it went through and they listed probably about 20 different things in total. So you can find the full report at that link. But I would take the main takeaway from that is, interestingly, and maybe this is actually not to be morbid, but maybe this is actually a sign of the number of people who didn't leave the hospital. But there were no change to the readmission rate during the early days of during the first, like 8 or 9 months of COVID that fell in 2020 versus the time before that. Any comments, thoughts, questions here? All right, if you'll go to the next slide and pause there for a moment. I hope you learned a lot from our quick updates. If you're interested in finding out more about the DGC and its other activities, email me at dgc@myhealthdata.org. That email address is also on your screen.